We're discussing fertility in flux. What can state-funded IVF do for population growth? As many of you will be aware, fertility in the sense of total fertility rate, which is the average number of children born to a woman over her lifetime, is decreasing steadily, both globally and within most countries. And as we reported in BioNews last year, the number of babies being born to individual women in England and Wales is now at its lowest rate since 1938. And as this slide shows, newspapers and news websites regularly feature articles highlighting the different causes for the decline and potential solutions. And I believe that this topic is popular, actually, with digital news outlets, as the articles attract a lot of click-throughs and reader comments. And the often shocking headlines, of course, have something to do with that, appealing to the doom scrollers. And we've all doom scrolled perhaps a bit more recently than we would like to have done. But I think this New Scientist headline, "Are we really doomed? An entertaining guide to humanity's extinction," certainly would encourage me to click through. Unfortunately, the New Scientist is behind a paywall and I don't have a subscription, but I'd like to think they've tried to inject some humour into the article. Now, the PET team have been looking through the extensive BioNews archive, not doom scrolling, I hasten to add, and have created a specially curated series of articles for you to read on this topic, because we've been publishing for more than 25 years. So we've covered this topic many times over the years. And so you'll be able to find that in the new In Focus section of the PET website. And this In Focus on population decline has been kindly sponsored by the IFFS, the International Federation of Fertility Societies. So do take a look. Our first speaker this evening is Professor Anne Berrington. She is Professor of Demography and Social Statistics at the University of Southampton, and is Director of the Fertility and Family Research Group and Principal Investigator of two current research projects at the Centre for Population Change and at the Connecting Generations Research Programme. She's a contributor to books including Fertility, Health and Lone Parenting, Childlessness in Europe, and the Research Handbook on Sociology of the Family.
Sarah asked you to address the question as to why fertility has been declining and to review some policy options to increase it. And in answering this question, I'm going to draw on others' work, but also some evidence that I've produced with colleagues at the Centre for Population Change. So as Sarah described in her introduction, fertility rates have been declining globally. And here we see the total fertility rate in different world regions from 1950 through to 2024, and then projected through to 2100. And you'll see that since 1950, globally, fertility rates have halved from around 5 children per woman to about 2.3. You'll see also that there remains some heterogeneity in world regions, but it is interesting to note that 2/3 of the world's population are now living in a country with below replacement level fertility, around 2.1 children per woman. The other reason for showing you this graph is to remind everybody about the fact that different countries experienced this fertility decline at different speeds. And it's that speed of fertility decline which is really driving the speed of population aging. So I just got one slide, which seems rather inadequate, but nevertheless, one slide on why is declining fertility an issue. And of course, there are positive aspects to fertility decline, not least less stress on the environment and potential reductions in carbon emissions. However, the media and policymakers do tend to be focusing on the negative implications, and these can be articulated at the macro, meso and micro level. So for example, at the macro level, we might look at rapid population aging and population decline in China, where the population of China is projected to halve over the next 100 years. Or at the family level, reductions in the number of children each woman has means that there are fewer adult children potentially able to provide social care. And this slide from some CPC kinship modelling shows that by 2055, the absolute number of childless women aged 80 or over will roughly triple. And then we come to the micro level, and much attention has focused on the fact that sort of average achieved family sizes are less than intended family sizes. And this so-called fertility gap is greater in some countries, particularly those in Southern Europe, for example, than others, suggesting that there are real barriers to couples and individuals achieving the number of children that they want. So, well, why has this decline occurred? Global fertility decline is a multifaceted issue. And I thought it was just useful to show this framework because it really reminds us that the remote determinants that we all talk about, like, reductions in child mortality or changes in gender role attitude, can only affect fertility through these proximate determinants. So, for example, if we take increased female education, how might that be associated with fertility decline? It's largely through a delay in marriage or a sexual union and increased use of efficient contraception, for example. And we might want to come back to this framework in the discussion. So, government policy and the response to this fertility decline. There's an expanding academic literature which examines the impact of family-friendly and pronatalist policies in high-income countries, including recent excellent reviews by Bergsvik and colleagues in 2021 and Gauthier and Gosden in 2024. But in general, these reviews suggest that access to quality, high-quality, affordable childcare and well-paid, sufficiently long parental leaves can have positive effects on fertility. The literature also seems to have reached a consensus that the impact of cash incentives, such as baby bonuses, tends to be small and sometimes tends to have short-term impact, affecting fertility tempo, so the timing of childbearing, rather than the quantum, i.e. how many women couples end up with. I like these charts from Bern Murdoch. In his article, or in their article, they are suggesting that, in fact, cultural factors appear to be more associated with levels of fertility as compared with the amount of money a government spends on family-friendly policies. And if you've seen what's on the horizontal axes of the ones at the bottom, you'll have seen that fertility rates are much lower in countries where mothers spend more time doing hands-on parenting and in countries where children spend a higher amount of time on their homework. Now, these indicators are related to intensive parenting, which is, of course, a particular issue in East Asia. And I think that's one of the areas where we need more work on looking at the relationship between intensive parenting and the declines in fertility. So, demographers in the 1980s and 90s and early 2000s looked to the Nordic countries as examples of where women had relatively high rates of labour force participation supported by family-friendly policies. And you can see that during the first part of this century, these Nordic countries had fertility rates not that much below replacement level. However, demographers and others have had to reconsider the role of these supportive family policies because of the significant and sustained fertility declines in these countries, such that you can see, for example, for Finland, that's the red dots at the bottom. The most recent estimate for 2023 was just 1.3 children per woman. So lowest low fertility, we normally think of it as something occurring in Southern Europe, now also occurring in the Nordic countries. Many demographers are trying to explain these recent declines over the past decade or so. They've occurred not just in the Nordic countries, but many other high-income countries, including the US and the UK. And I'm going to now present briefly five areas that I think are associated with this recent decline, and hence areas which governments need to address to improve reproductive choice. So first of all, gender evolution theory tells us that we'll only have relatively high levels of fertility if we have gender equity in the private sphere as well as the public sphere. So we need to ensure that men and women equally share, for example, childcare. And you can see from this chart, from a paper that we recently wrote about flexible working and share of childcare duties, many duties, particularly those that conflict with the working day, are primarily still carried out by women. So, as you know, we have an incomplete gender revolution. The second area that we've done work in is the importance of addressing the extended and fractured transitions to adulthood that now face many young adults in the UK. So for many young adults, the first step in this transition to adulthood is achieving residential independence. But as you know, that's become harder, and a higher proportion of young adults are living with a parent. And in the Generations and Gender survey, we asked young adults who were living with their parents why they were doing that. And from these percentages that you can see, economic reasons dominate. Yes, some people are preferring to live with their parents and find it very convenient, but half of these young adults are giving economic reasons. So a quarter said they couldn't afford to live away from the parental home, and another quarter are saving for future housing costs. So this is suggesting that the government needs to address these housing issues. Then we get to the labour market and economic insecurities, particularly for younger adults, but also those who are slightly older. And there are two bits of evidence I'm quickly going to show you. One is how it is the changing patterns of childlessness and who is more likely to be childless. Now, traditionally in high-income countries, we think of highly educated women being more likely to remain childless at the end of their reproductive years. However, this has been changing, particularly in Finland, shown here, but in other countries also as well. So what we're seeing is that the increase in childlessness is particularly large amongst those with the least resources, again suggesting the importance of economic factors being a barrier to entry into parenthood. So here in Finland, you're looking at birth cohorts from 1940 to 78, and the red line is childlessness amongst those with just basic education, which increased from about 13% up to over a quarter. Coming back to the UK, a lot of work in demography is emphasising not only objective current economic circumstances, so whether you've got a job, but also how perceived economic insecurity is affecting people's childbearing behaviour. So thinking again to those Nordic declines, unemployment rates have actually gone down in the Nordic countries during this period, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the perception of economic insecurity has also gone down. And here in the UK Generations and Gender survey, we're asking people about whether they want to have a child. So we're focusing on childless men and women aged 18 to 45. We're saying, do you intend to have a child? The potential answers are definitely no, probably no, which we've grouped, unsure, or definitely yes, and probably yes. And we've done some regression analyses, and we're looking here as to the proportions who say, let's say definitely yes, probably yes, that's the black circles. And you can see that those who say that their future financial situation will be much better or much better are far more likely to intend to have a child. Again, indicating that the government needs to address this economic precarity. Now, finally, I'm very acutely aware that coming up are lots of experts in medically assisted reproduction, but I thought I'd just give my fourth penny worth from the demographic perspective. Noting, of course, that MAR is not universally acceptable or available to all populations. We do know, however, from example, analysis of Swedish register data, that when couples do have insurance coverage, couples do increase their uptake, suggesting there is an unmet demand. Although it's not clear to me that any studies have really got at quantifying what that demand actually is. But we might think that it's important to widen access to make it more affordable and for different family types. Now, clearly from demography, we know that men and women are postponing their childbearing to later ages. And of course, at older ages, some MAR techniques success rates can be lower. So what can we do about that? Well, we need to consider whether it's possible to increase knowledge of age-related fertility decline, but I'd be interested to hear about evidence for this policy evaluation. I don't think there is much. We could encourage an earlier age at entry, but when we start to go into those sorts of population policies, you run into problems about female autonomy and gender equity. We could examine unmet need for egg freezing, but again, we run into problems of acceptability, affordability, and practicality. So in summary, I would hope that I've outlined why reasons for fertility decline are complex and multifaceted. There's no single policy fix. We know that many policies, such as subsidised childcare, are necessary, but they're not sufficient to support childbearing. Many additional solutions require joined-up action to support young adults in their transition to adulthood, not least increased economic security and the provision of affordable housing. And also the demographers have written widely, warning about how pronatalist policies such as cash incentives do tend to have negative effects on reproductive rights and often reduce gender equality.
So our next speaker is Professor David Bell, Emeritus Professor of Economics at the University of Stirling. David is Principal Investigator at the Healthy Aging in Scotland study, co-investigator at the Centre for Population Change and at the Connecting Generations Research Programme. He's advisor to numerous committees of the Scottish Parliament and of the UK Parliament, and he's a contributor to books including The Scottish Economy, Debating Scotland, and the Routledge Handbook of the Economics of Ageing.
I'm delighted to be taking part in this conference. I will have slightly economics in focus in what I talk about, and some of the points that I will make reproduces what Anne has already said. Anne is a colleague in the Centre for Population Change, which is based at the Universities of Southampton, St Andrews and Stirling. So, okay. So I will go very, very quickly, because we've already gone through it, around global fertility trends and talk a little bit about the UK, talk about causes of falling fertility rates, and like Anne, I will emphasise economic factors and raise another few factors which perhaps she hasn't raised, but which are perhaps a bit speculative. But perhaps worth considering. So the standard, as Anne said, in terms of global fertility rates, in the 1950s, total fertility was around 5 children per woman and is now around 2.3. Replacement fertility levels around 2.1. And this is a pretty unprecedented demographic transition. There are regional variations both between countries and within countries, but as Anne showed in one of her slides, the downward trend is pretty much universal. In the UK, fertility rates declined from about 2.7 children per woman in 1960 down to about 1.49 in 2022, which was well below the replacement level. The decline, well, there's a spectrum of declines, but the UK's has been relatively fast. And again, within the UK, there are marked differences across the country. So Scotland has a particularly low fertility rate at 1.3, and its population would be declining, obviously, were it not for the fact that there has been net in-migration over the last couple of decades, which has allowed the population to gradually increase. So the UK is declining faster than most of the other G7 countries, and at slightly different speeds, but the general trend is kind of obvious. Anne emphasised housing. Housing is a huge issue in the UK, and the perceptions of the cost of housing is as important as the actual costs. So home ownership often seen as a prerequisite for family formation, and relatively small proportion of new of young people leaving education are able to find a sufficient deposit to buy a house, so they tend to rent, and because of that, or the UK rental market is characterised by a degree of insecurity. Childcare costs add to the difficulty. Again, it's perception. A UK average might be £300 a week for under threes, and in London, £430 per week, which makes childcare relatively expensive in the UK. So these numbers are not meant to particularly mean anything, but the set of potential barriers to having children are listed here: housing costs, childcare costs, career pressures, financial insecurity, and another issue that Anne didn't raise is student debt. So many students going to higher education take on debt and effectively pay an additional income tax of 9% on top of whatever tax rate they're paying. So that can act as a deterrent to having children. The continuing low fertility and excess demand for housing is going to have very profound effects on the distribution of wealth in the UK. Housing is perhaps the most important store of wealth in the UK, and those who are lucky enough to be inheriting wealth will find that it is becoming a larger and larger proportion of their lifetime wealth, because incomes have not been growing at the same rate as housing wealth. So the baby boomers like me will be holding a substantial proportion of current housing wealth, and will be passing it on to succeeding those smaller generations. The consequence of that is that wealth becomes more concentrated as fertility declines, which will increase inequality and reduce social mobility. So cultural causes, Anne have touched on quite a lot of these. Changing attitudes, effectively a decline in the wish to have children, delayed partnerships, educational attainment. There is a large gap now in tertiary education, higher education in the UK, with a significantly higher proportion of students being female rather than male. So there is quite a large gap, which means that women are leaving education typically later than men are, issues of work-life balance, which effectively Anne talked about, and also the move towards sorry, I've jumped on one too quickly there. Let me go back to fewer partnerships. So delayed partnership formation, a variety of potential causes. Age of first-time mothers, the delay has now gone from the average age of first-time mothers in the UK from 23.7 to 30.7. So that's an increase of 7 years over the period of over that 50-year period. Again, the factors include those that I've already mentioned. Environmental issues, environmental anxiety affecting family planning. It is only circumstantial evidence, but ethical considerations about population growth. And in the UK, perhaps limited family policies compared to the Nordic countries, although as Anne has shown, the decline in fertility has also occurred in Nordic countries. The UK has gone through a period of what's called austerity as well, and some argue that the difficulty caused by that, which is essentially about reduced welfare benefits, has had a negative effect, although that's pretty difficult to quantify. And on a number of accounts, the UK lags behind other European countries in terms of shorter paid parental leave, less childcare subsidies, less housing support. Perhaps Anne would argue about the countries with more generous family policies tend to have higher fertility rates. That's an interesting area to explore. So where the UK population structure may be heading, which is not untypical. In fact, it's less extreme than several other European countries like Italy and Spain, is one towards much greater proportion of the population being over retirement age, a shrinking working age population, and that causing all kinds of pressures, including those on healthcare and pension systems and so on, which again eventually will have effects on economic conditions, which in turn will affect willingness to undertake family formation. So among the potential policy responses, one of the principal ones is increased affordable housing supply, and the current UK government is intent on increasing affordable housing supply. Whether it will succeed is a very much an open question. Policies around rent stabilisation and support of first-time buyers may contribute, and there are a set of policies here which may have a small effect, but all of them are now going to be subject to a fiscal situation which was already difficult before we had the last couple of weeks of upset to the world system of trade, and may become even more unaffordable in consequence of that. So I think that's my conclusion. Housing costs, childcare expenses, career pressures are very important in terms of reducing total fertility rates, and it's not obvious that there are easy policy solutions to turn that head of steam around.
Next, we have Professor Søren Ziebe. He is the Professor of Clinical Embryology at the University of Copenhagen's Faculty of Health and Medical Sciences, and he is the Senior Scientist at the Rigshospitalet Laboratory of Reproductive Biology. Søren is co-author of research exploring how to talk to young adults about fertility and exploring pros and cons of fertility awareness and information. And he's a contributor to books including Human Preimplantation, Embryo Selection. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing his presentation.
Before I start my presentation, I think there's two things that I would like to touch upon. One of them is what we call fertility awareness, which we talk a lot about here in Denmark currently. And in this publication, fertility awareness is defined as the understanding of reproduction, fecundity, and related risk factors. And here comes the important part, including the awareness of societal and cultural factors affecting the options to meet reproductive family planning and family building needs. Meaning that when we talk about knowledge about fertility and so on, and factors affecting our ability to have children, is not just what we do as people, but also how society is tailored and support, as has been suggested also in the two previous lectures. Then I want to share a little story here taking place in Gambela, which is in the borderline between South Sudan and Ethiopia, where the Merle people lives. And the Merle people have acquired a habit of kidnapping children from the neighboring tribes. And according to local sources, this is due to low fertility, which may be connected to a culturally conditioned tradition of only having sex on the days where the women are menstruating. And I think that this example illustrates the importance of recognizing that we have a biological drive to have children as human beings. It's not just about choosing to have, but being human creatures, of being creatures that we as humans also have a biological drive to have children. And that knowledge about our reproductive biology and its limitation is extremely important. And we have worked here also with fertility education to try to illustrate this. And realizing that the impact of culture on reproduction and the impact of reproduction on culture are factors that we should tailor in when we consider these things. So back to today's lecture. So with the title, if fertility treatment is a solution to population decline, then the reason behind population decline is fertility problems in people with a desire to have children. And the need for fertility treatment can be significantly reduced simply by ensuring sufficient and timely knowledge in the population about the possibilities and limitations in our reproductive biology. Here I'm sharing a curve of percentage of women in Denmark who had not given birth to a child. And what you can see in this curve is that when women are age 20, almost none of them have given birth. We have very few, extremely few teenage pregnancies in Denmark. So almost 100% of women aged 20 have not given birth. And as the women become older, some of them start to have birth, and the number is, of course, going down. If you go to the other end of the curve, when a woman is 70 years old, 12% of them have never given birth. When they're 60 years old, 12% has never given birth. When they're 50 years old, 12% has not given birth. When they're 44%, 12% has not given birth. When they're 42, 12%. when they are 41, 13%. And so 12% of all women above 42 have never given birth to a child. So if you look into these 12%, they have to be separated into three different groups. There's a group that is classified as child-free. They don't want to have children, and they stick with that desire until it's too late. I think that the majority of us have tried to be at least hesitant. Should I have children? Should I not have children? And then suddenly we meet and a nice girl don't want to kiss us, and then we start to have children. But some people don't want to have children and stick to that decision. That's in Denmark is around 3%, and it doesn't seem to change. Then we have another group, which is biologically childless. They would have liked to have children, but they couldn't have it. And there are many different reasons for that, and it's probably tied up to the availability of fertility treatment also. And then we have a third group who would like to have children, but are childless by circumstances. Somehow life just didn't happen in a way that the women had children. In Denmark, there is a huge telling about young people do not want to have children, and this is the reason behind the decline in birth rate and in total fertility rates. It doesn't seem to be true. I mean, we have all, as I said, had period of our lives where we were in doubt whether to have children or not. When I was that age, it was nuclear power and nuclear bombs and that kind of thing. And now it's probably climate and what is going on of horrendous things in the world that sort of causes the doubt of whether to have children or not. But as we leave our parents and get out in the world on our own, we are all anxious. Can I take responsibility for all these things? And then as we gain more and more confidence, then we start to take responsibility for taking decisions that impact our life, and including that is also to have children. So in Denmark, 11%, 1 in 8 children born in Denmark is conceived at a fertility clinic. And on top of that, our Prime Minister announced in her New Year address 2024 that people that couldn't have children would get more help. She said that involuntary childlessness affects far too many. If it's not us, then it's somebody we know. There's still taboos that we need to break. Just think how beautiful it is that so many people dream of creating new life. And to those of you sitting out there waiting for a child, for those, all of you future mothers and fathers and families in all colors of the rainbow who carry around a homeless love, you now get more help. And what the government have introduced now is that they doubled the number of treatment attempts free of charge in the public hospitals, meaning that you can now have, instead of 3, up to 6 cycles free of charge. And they also introduced that we could have free access to a second child free of charge at the public health system. So these things are quite new. We don't know the effect of it on birth rates yet. It will probably have some effect. It has just previously alluded to the total fertility rate in the world. I think it's important that we acknowledge that the total fertility rate has been declining since the 1960s and are now approaching or very close to the replacement level. The replacement level being the level where you have one child to replace the father and one child to replace the mother. So from that perspective, the world is in balance now. But there are huge regional differences. This is a group of countries that are outlined here, which, according to the Lancet demographic publication from 2000, are going to have changing populations over the coming 70 years. This is numbers from 2017 compared to 2000 2,100, which might seem far away, but the children born today is going to experience this. Denmark, not much is going to happen. Germany, minus 20% in population size. Spain, minus 51%. Greece, minus 47%. Italy, minus 50%. Netherlands, minus 20%. Norway, plus 42%. And Sweden, plus 31%. So in total, by year 2100, these 7 countries together will be reduced by 73 million people. So today we ask is if can we compensate through assisted reproduction? We have a publication here, an editorial a couple of years back, where Bert Fauser wrote that now more than 2.5 million cycles are being performed every year, resulting in over 500,000 deliveries annually. If this is the sort of success rate of the contribution of assisted reproduction, then to compensate for a population decline above 73 million, we need 366 million cycles. And this is for these countries equals to 3% of the world population and 32% of the European population. I think this raises the question to what degree we can, should, or will use medical treatments as an alternative to preventing the condition. At the same time, I mean, we're talking about the state-funded thing here. Why are we seeing governmental reluctancy to prevent or treat reproductive diseases in many countries? This is a study as I was part of myself, and where we show that the net tax revenue made it an extremely good business for governments to invest in assisted reproduction if you looked at it in a lifetime perspective. So to finalize this, is fertility treatment a solution to population decline? I would say no, but fertility treatment is an excellent solution to families with fertility problems and reproductive diseases. I would say no, but investing in fertility awareness and treatments when needed may be very good business for societies. I would say no, but fixing the fertility problems may be part of the answer to population decline. And I would say no, but fertility treatment is a way to increase life quality in many families. Assisted reproduction leads to a lot of children, a lot of nephews, a lot of nieces.
Following on from Søren, we have Satu Rautakallio-Hokkanen, who is the General Director of Fertility Europe. And she was a contributor to the recent Economist Impact Report, Fertility Policy and Practice, a Toolkit for Europe. And she is a co-author of ESHRE, the European Society of Human Reproduction and Embryology's good practice recommendations on add-ons in reproductive medicine.
So just a few words about Fertility Europe. We are already 16 years old patient association. We are registered in Brussels, Belgium, and we are a patient partner association of ESHRE. We also represent our 33 national infertility associations as our members, and they are coming from 28 different European countries. We just released our new strategy for next 3 years. And just to give you a short introduction what our mission will be, the mission is all about inclusion, empowerment, and advocacy, because reproductive rights and fertility awareness should be for everyone. And our vision for the coming 3 years is that this is a future where no one is left behind. We want equal access, informed choices, and full support for every fertility journey. When I was invited to this event, I was first shown the title of "Can Free IVF to All Resolve Falling Birth Rates?" And like we already heard from Søren, the answer is no. But why not? Because about 20% of people in their reproductive age face infertility, and this is estimated to be around 25 million people in Europe only. There are two groups of reasons. There are medical reasons and there are social reasons. Medical reasons being, of course, diseases and other health-related conditions. And we also have unexplained infertility that nobody can solve. The social reasons, one of the biggest reasons at the moment is that people don't find a suitable partner, or they have financial challenges. It's an economical thing, or the society restricts ways to have children with legislation or regulations. So out of these 20% of people, some of them get pregnant. They have these miracle pregnancies and they have a baby. Some have babies with fertility treatments. Some never get babies despite fertility treatments. Some people just leave the treatments unfinished for various reasons. Some never seek for help. They just think that it is what it is. And then again, some people don't find a suitable partner. And then the economical side, some people just can't afford the treatments. Last year, Fertility Europe published a new version of Atlas. This was the second version last year. And the Atlas map is about European fertility treatments policies 2024. And it shows in traffic lights what is the situation in different European countries. So the greener the country, the better is the access to treatments. And the more red the country is, the worse is the situation in that country. And by the way, the data behind this was partially from ESRE's EIM consortium. And then we also made some questions to our members so that we could get the patient view very visible. So if we take from Atlas case Nordics, we have already heard about the Nordic countries in previous presentations, but I just collected here the total fertility rates from 22 and then from 24. And as you can see, it's going down in all the Nordic countries. But still, the Atlas ranking shows that access to treatments in Denmark, in Finland are really good. They are very green. Sweden and Norway are also very nice. Iceland, not that good, but still quite good. But still, their fertility is declining. And just to show you, for example, in Finland, that this is very regional, because, for example, since central Ostrobothnia, the highest birth rate. It's 1.72. But again, in southern Finland, in Kymenlaakso region, it's very low. It's 1.06. So, case Finland, because I'm from Finland and I know more researchers from here. Why don't people have children? Some of them are childless by choice. And I was surprised to hear, Søren, did you say that 4% of Danish people are basically...
3%.
Yeah, but the research here shows that it's 13% of people in their reproductive age. They have environmental reasons, like we heard from Søren. They are not interested to have children. They don't hate children. Most of them don't hate children, but they have children around them as relatives. And some people just desire to be independent and free and decide what they do with their lives. And then there are, of course, the medical reasons and the insecurity in life, like short-term employment, career aspirations, and definitely for women, they have to think when and if to have children if they want to have a career. And then the fact that people don't find a partner. And at the moment, it looks like almost half of the men at the age of 35 in Finland are childless. And 10 years after that, still 30% of men and 20% of women at the age of 45 are still childless. And then again, when you ask Finnish people, how many children do you want? They mostly say they want to have 2 children. So this doesn't go together what they get. So this also worried our government last year. So they ordered, the Ministry of Social Affairs and Health ordered Professor Anna Rotkirch to prepare a report about identifying the factors affecting the birth rate. And Professor Rotkirch provided a 20 points list of proposals how to make this change. And I just collected a few of these items here. So Professor Rothkild said that increasing fertility awareness in schools should be mandatory. And this is what Fertility Europe, for example, has done. We released last year our interactive game for 15 to 18 years old children. And we are now promoting it in 19 countries because the game is already translated to 19 languages. People should be offered a centralized sexual and reproductive health counseling and services. One point was investing in fertility treatments, which is getting better this year because the government has already decided to put some more money to it. And then investing in prevention of mental health problems and supporting family-friendly workplaces and reconciliation of work and family life. So, what is puzzling me is if the government, if the world wants more babies, why is it that those who really want them but can't have them are not helped? Because what we need is a right to high quality, non-discriminating care, proper legislation and access to care, access to financial and psychosocial support, improve the rights of those in need for care, and raise fertility and infertility awareness facts, which is our game also called. And we need the good planning for society to support those reproductive rights for everyone.
We have Professor Roger Gosden. Roger is a visiting scholar at William and Mary, which is a university in Virginia in the USA. He is the former director of research at Weill Cornell Medicine, Eastern Virginia Medical School, and McGill University. Roger studied and collaborated with the IVF pioneer, Professor Sir Robert Edwards, and went on to write his authorized biography, Let There Be Life, an intimate portrait of Robert Edwards and his IVF revolution. He's also the founder of Jamestown Bookworks, which has published biographies of other pioneers, including Walter Heap, Robert Tuttle Morris, and Howard W. Jones Jr. He's must never be still, Roger, with all these different activities.
Human reproduction is a paradox. We're a very infertile species, yet have a population explosion that helped me to choose a career in reproduction research in the 1970s. But that fear is now dissolved by a population implosion. Historically high fertility and short lifespans turned upside down. Birth rates are falling, more for socio-economic reasons than better contraception, and we live longer. Elon Musk calls it an existential threat, though I won't elevate it above global warming. He has fathered 13 or 14 children, some with IVF. Perhaps he knows how many. But odd high scores like that won't fix our problem. We need to understand the interests of women and encourage a family-friendly culture. Previous speakers already answered the question posed by this meeting. IVF raises birth rates, but not by much. Geeta Nargund estimated 0.04. Coming at the end of 8 presentations, I'm going to summarize and mention some uncovered topics, and more globally. Population age pyramids are evolving. Madagascar on the left has a high mortality rate and a high total fertility rate, well above the tipping point for replacement, 2.1, although it's closer probably to 2.3 when you have a high infant mortality or excess of male over female births. On the right-hand side, South Korea is in a population crisis from a steep decline with a TFR now of 0.78. The bulge of older people will strain national prosperity, welfare, even defence. The UK in the middle is higher at 1.49, David says. bit lower than what I've put here, though still worrying, like the USA at 1.66. I agree with Bart Fowler last time. There is a primary humanitarian case for government support for treating infertility and fertility preservation for medical need, and Søren endorsed that today. The extra IVF babies help to stabilize populations, which is a good return economically. What is a finer investment than in a nation's future bloodstock? Satu said that the EU has 25 million people with infertility. That's about 1 in 6. But we don't know how many need a financial incentive before starting a family with ARTs. Paul Morland last time pointed out that population decline isn't mainly an infertility problem, so treatment isn't a panacea. Taking Søren's country, Denmark, for example, is top of the league for IVF births, yet its TFR is only about 1.5, still lagging replacement. The Austrian demographer Wolfgang Lutz points out that low fertility creates self-reinforcing mechanisms that can aggravate population decline. He calls it an infertility trap. I'm illustrating with these connected circles. Demographers, like David, draw a tight negative correlation between a nation's GDP and its fertility. The birth rate goes down with prosperity, even spiraling faster sometimes. Those rates start falling long before a country gets rich, even in the poorest country, Niger. There's been a social revolution so welcome that's raised women's rights for self-determination, the freedom to choose a career and different lifestyle to traditional homemaker and mother. Education has been a ticket for self-fulfillment and rising in the business world and professions that were male bastions. I've seen the change in the faces, male versus female, in my student classes over the years. Women say the ideal family is smaller and later than in the past. We've heard that 10 to 13% want to stay childless. It's no longer a social stigma. The reasons why family isn't the priority for a fulfilled life are numerous. Costs of childcare to age 18 and beyond, job security, recessions, international conflict, etc., and you name it. They keep depressing birth rates that rarely reverse. Immigration compensates for the baby bust in some Western countries. Now, 1 in 4 is a migrant, either primary or secondary, in Sweden. Coming mostly from low-income countries, they bolster workforces and help to counter the slump in births. But it is temporary relief. Their children adopt the norms of the adoptive country, and they won't always be coming. India has population momentum, but a time is coming when migration will stall as the country makes its own demographic transition. Then there is the environment of poor countries, particularly as a population determinant, though hard to track. Births and infants' survival are set back by pandemics, pollution, environmental disasters, and topical today, withdrawal of international aid for food and water security and vaccination against infectious diseases. I have dreamt of a simulation model to plug in changes so we can, say, look at a difference in immigration or fertility to get numerical predictions. My son is an actuary in London, and we worked together with some algorithms, but only ended up dizzy from so many spinning variables and gave up. The news from America is dire across the board for reproduction research and international aid, with population implications. The world's chief funder cut thousands of federal grants and jobs in the last month. Some of my retired contacts shared impressions, but others were unwilling to talk or were muzzled. Donald Trump announced he would increase access to IVF in February and lower costs, but don't hold your breath or expect more states to mandate insurance cover. He wants to please technocratic pronatalists and antagonists of IVF at the same time, and hasn't spoken yet to leaders in reproductive medicine. Last week, the CDC's ART monitoring service closed. Satu presented to us a more settled but variable policy across Europe. Some countries, of course, will restrict it to married couples and heterosexuals, or prohibit genetic testing. But even in Scandinavia, generous national support for family formation, childcare, and parental leave haven't lifted the TFR much above 1.5. The South Korean capital, Seoul, is pinning hope on grants of 1 million won, that's about $780, for IVF. But is this token incentive enough? And is 2 million won for social egg freezing a sound investment if most eggs aren't used or donated? When a government's coffers are stretched like now, it feels no compelling urgency to tackle a multiplex long-term problem, so it postpones to future administrations. As the demographic trajectory casts a long shadow, my hope turns to research for more accessible and effective and cheaper IVF. If American science is in retreat, we look to Britain and Europe, China and Australia for leadership here. ARTs are expensive and successful only about 30% of the time, and less with age. Commercialization hinders research investment, and government grant agencies don't give it enough priority. Medical charities can't fill the gap, although Elon's loose change could help. However, there are some green shoots. Entrepreneurs are miniaturizing the IVF lab, which is the highest cost center. In vitro oocyte maturation, or IVM, is getting a new burst of life for simplifying cycles. The ultimate technology for overcoming oocyte scarcity is in vitro growth, or IVG, but has made slow progress since starting 40 years ago in John Epic's lab in Maine and mine in Edinburgh. An ovarian biopsy can potentially yield all the eggs a patient will need, plus spares for the freezer. More patients will access IVF if protocols are simpler and cheaper. But the inexorable aging of eggs stumps technology for women who postpone childbearing. Egg donation is a narrow remedy. Oocytes accumulate damage the longer they stay in their primordial follicle, making them less viable and causing aneuploidy. The deterioration is suspended when eggs or ovarian biopsies are frozen. But is there another way? The immunosuppressant drug rapamycin improves egg quality in mice and is currently in a clinical trial for extending fertility in women. Incidentally, the genetic constitution of animals bred repeatedly at late ages is shifted by selection of genes and alleles that favor delayed fecundity and greater longevity. Theoretically, generations of women starting their family later will extend fertility in our species. But I think we will colonize Mars long before that happens. As for males, sperm counts are falling at 1 to 2% annually, and half worldwide, though still above the threshold of subfertility. John Aitken suspects endocrine disruptors are responsible, perhaps suppressing testosterone needed for spermatogenesis. we underestimate the toll of environmental pollution on health. ICSI, or sperm injection, has revolutionized male fertility treatment since the 1990s, but has a downside. Sperm research seemed superfluous after it solved severe oligospermia, so research for repairing spermatogenesis lapsed, and we continue to lean on sperm donation. They have a much higher mutation rate than eggs from continuous divisions in spermatogenesis, and environmental toxins cause oxidative DNA damage. Antioxidant prophylaxis isn't a remedy, as far as we're aware, for improving sperm quality. And then there's biologists who, like me, often criticize ICSI for indiscriminate use in 80 to 90% of cycles in America, when there's no evidence of a sperm defect, which raises costs and more. When ICSI bypasses sperm competition for fertilization, genetic defects in fertility can be transmitted that natural selection would otherwise have eliminated. So beware of excessive use of ARTs in case they aggravate the genetic load for future generations, making them less fertile. The degenerate Y chromosome is a poster example of this. When palindromic DNA recombines to form loops, deleting the AFZ, or in Britain I should say AFZC region, the patient's father children with ICSI, but their sons inherit the deletion and will need ICSI in turn to become fathers, and so on in perpetuity. John warns that IVF may have detrimental effects for human evolution too. In the wild state, natural selection promotes fertility and genetic fitness because the most fertile genotypes produce more children who inherit the advantage. But in an era of low birth rates, they make a shrinking contribution to the genetic pool, whereas in fertile people, using ARTs will pass on heritable defects that makes the population less fertile. The infertility trap adds to a gloomy forecast. I turn to research for solace, so I'm sorry to end on another pessimistic note. If we can't turn birth rates around, what next? Margaret Atwood's dystopian novel, The Handmaid's Tale, portrays a country based in the USA, which she calls Gilead. It suffers from the blight of infertility caused by an environmental disaster. The crisis triggers a revolution by patriarchal dictators who control women's bodies to fill the baby gap. The story means that unless liberal democracy can restore birth and death rates to balance, there is a risk of an authoritarian regime stepping in to control human reproduction. Note that in the US today, the far right embraces pronatalism. In closing, I want to recommend John Aitken's book for further reading and thank PET for including me in this very interesting meeting.
If any of the panel very quickly have any questions for each other, now is your chance to ask them. And if not, then I will move on quickly to the Q&A. I'm not seeing anyone raise their hands on the panel. Okay, so Geeta Nargund, who spoke at the last event, has asked, do you think the sole focus on fertility rate undermines women's well-being, reproductive choices, and rights? So I think I'll go to Anne first with that one and then see if anyone else wants to chip in.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And the answer is the TFR is not a good indicator of many of the things that we should and are worried about. So, for example, in terms of sustainable development goals, we've got goal 3, ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. And as part of that, target 3.7, for example, is universal access to sexual and reproductive care. And then in terms of sort of gender equity, we might be considering target 5.6, universal access to reproductive health and rights. So I'm mentioning this because the TFR tells us nothing about what proportion of women are able to make informed decisions about when they're having sex and use of contraception and so forth. And particularly, we know globally there's an issue with adolescent reproductive health and rights. So there is an awful lot to do there. I could give a statistical answer as well about how the TFR is a period measure and actually doesn't really tell us much about how many children a woman will end up with, but we'll leave that for another time.
Does anyone else want to come in on that one? Yes, David.
Just on the general question of well-being, I'm not a fertility expert, but I do a lot on well-being, and with my co-author David Blanchflower, we have become increasingly concerned about mental health, particularly of young women, over certainly in the post-pandemic period. And it goes to show that there are lots of things going on for people, and fertility obviously is a very important consideration in relation to our joint futures, but there are other things to be thinking about.
Does anybody else want to come in on this, or shall I move on? Yeah, Søren.
I just think it's important that we, as a principle, says that children is something that we have together, men and women. And I mean, we measure a lot of things by the woman because she's the one giving birth. But if we want to solve problems, we need to address it as a couple's decision. Otherwise, we're just putting the blame on the women, and it could equally be men having problems or on being unwilling to commit or whatever it is. So I just think that we need to say that out loud.
So keeping on the subject of men, someone has asked, should governments be considering educational campaign targeting male behaviour in relation to sharing childcare? Which is not one that I don't think I've come across that one before. So I don't know if anyone wants to tackle that first. I think perhaps, yep. Anne, you raised it in your presentation a bit about that, that poor division of labour.
Yes, I did. And it's a really interesting question, but I don't think it is the role. It's not education of men that is required per se. There are things that are more prescient. For example, policies and employers' policies regarding, for example, shared parental leave. So we know, for example, that a tiny fraction of UK men take up their proportion of shared parental leave essentially because they can't afford it, because it's not funded at the correct level, which is why in my talk I talked about well-paid, sufficiently long parental leaves. So that would be a great first step. And I think that we are moving in the right direction. Work flexibilization has pros and cons, but we have shown, for example, with the work from the Generations and Gender Survey, that working from home and working time flexibility is associated with a greater likelihood of sharing domestic chores.
Søren, I think you wanted to come on this one as well.
Yeah, I just want to mention that in Denmark, we have a couple of years ago had state-funded maternity leave to the men also. I mean, not as much as for the women, but I think that we have in total 8 weeks paid leave for the men. And I just saw some data recently saying that by now, in average, men uses 6.8 weeks or something, close to the full parental leave that they can have. And more undocumented. When you're looking around among young men in Denmark now, they want to be part of it. They severely want to be part of it, and they want to have leave, and they sometimes pay themselves also to be together with their child. So I think that we have a change in culture in Denmark around these things.
Roger.
I've been struck by a number of the presentations that seem to show that government action really has a limited impact. And I'd say the same about research as well. So it leaves a huge challenge. Yes,
I think that has been a bit of an underlying theme in this about, so the question is, what is going to work? And so moving on then to the next question, which is for Satu, who's someone who's anonymous, says, if everyone who needed fertility treatment received it, how much difference would it make?
That's probably meant in figures.
Yes, but I think, well, you can interpret it how you like.
Well, I'm not a scientist. I don't know about the figures or how to evaluate that, but can you ask me the question again? How much?
Yes, if everyone who needed fertility treatment received it, how much difference would it make?
Well, for those who need the fertility treatment, it would make a huge difference. I'm quite sure. When I said that it doesn't resolve this decline of population, it's not that, but I don't know how to answer to that. That's a very surprising question. Maybe
I think Roger wants to come in and help you.
Yeah,
so
if Roger could help me.
No, I'd love to help you, but I'm asking a question, and maybe Søren has an answer. Has a survey been carried out in any country to actually estimate how many of these people are waiting for the incentive of finance or easier treatment, or if there's a travel problem, which is a problem in America, of course, with a big country and very widespread clinics. Do we know how many people we're talking about, or the proportion? Søren, do you?
Yeah.
Because
no, we don't have precise numbers of this. But what we can say is that in a country like Denmark, who's very generous with access to treatment, I mean, we are doing 1 in 8 children, 11% of children but when you talk public IVF, you always have to say with the resources that the government have allocated. So that's in no way illustrative of the actual need. You can say that the additive effect of going for more cycles, in Denmark we went from 3 and up to a maximum of 6 cycles for the first child. That is estimated to increase the need of treatments by 39%. Then you can say, what would the offer of child number 2 add to that? And there we have to discuss, do we think that because you have a reproductive disease that you have other wishes for your life and your family than people that don't have reproductive diseases? And if we go to the Danish population, I think that would cover most countries, it's around, if I remember correct, 85% of all parents that have more than one child. So the vast majority of people that get a child through assisted reproduction would probably wish to have a second child also, or even a third, or whatever. So I think that's as close as we can get to it. I can just say also that we have data illustrating that there is a very strong socioeconomic bias in these things. Long distance to a clinic, meaning in Denmark that you come from a rural area where jobs are sparse, salaries are low. Taking off from work to go to a clinic is a full day thing, and can you afford to miss 5, 6, 7 days of salary per cycle? no, you can't. So we have a significant dropout in these areas. And that means that it's very difficult to put precise numbers in these things.
Great. I'm going to move on now to another question because they just keep coming. Jean Barrick Parker asks, this was to Anne, can you say more about how pronatalist policies involving cash payments have a negative impact?
Yeah, so that is also, I'm glad you've pushed back on me about that. It depends on the value of the cash payment. And I think I perhaps should have gone slower and made 2 points. So first of all, if the value of the cash payment is sufficient to have an effect, it has to be very large. That's what research has shown. And if it's going to be that large, then it is by definition going to be having an effect on people's reproductive rights and decision making. So that's one reason. The second reason is that cash incentives and pronatalist policies don't tend to exist on their own. They exist in sort of a wider sort of propaganda about the importance of fertility and population growth. Again, maybe restricting people's reproductive rights. And we know, for example, from Eastern Europe, the third point is that the campaigns, for example, by Viktor Orban to increase fertility by the use of cash incentives has been reducing gender equity because it's been emphasizing that the role of women is as mothers. And so it's almost going backwards in terms of gender equity. So that's what I would say if I had more time. Thank you.
Great. Does anyone else want to chip in on that? I think it's a slightly related question, which is for Anne and for David. And someone who says, is it too crude to think that writing off student debt for first-time parents might help? So I think that sort of relates to that sort of pronatalist incentive. So I think, David, you raised student loans in your presentation. So I'll let you go first on this one.
I don't know the answer, but there is an interesting natural experiment here in that tuition for higher education in Scotland is free, whereas in England it is not. So the levels of student debt are much higher in England than is the case in Scotland. So it would be interesting. Perhaps Anne would have the answer about how we might structure this experiment, but it would be interesting to see, given broadly similar cultures, whether there is indeed an effect on net student debt.
Yes. What do you think, Anne?
I think that, again, I was going to compare the UK to European countries where, of course, we don't have the same level of tuition fees and students tend to live, are more likely to live with their parents, so they're not racking up debts because of maintenance. And of course, we see that fertility is falling in those countries too. So I was going to use that as a reason. I think that in general, we do need to focus very hard on sort of financial and economic supports for young adults. They have been continuously eroded over the last sort of 40, 50 years in terms of welfare support. Our whole welfare system has become more familiarized in that sort of becoming more like Southern Europe in that young adults are increasingly economically dependent upon their parents to a later age. And so the Nordic countries have remained just to one side in that they are supporting young adults to attain residential independence. Of course, you could say to me, well, Anne, that doesn't seem to have stopped fertility declining there. But I think that it's a bit of and I think one of the persons in the question and answer is saying, isn't it too simplistic to expect governments to provide all this holistic support for families when we're facing, wars in Ukraine and a global financial crisis? In part, yes, but we need to invest in these young people because they are the future labour force, and we need to allow them to make these successful transitions to adulthood. And in answer to that question, I wouldn't be making this investment in young people simply so they can have children, but so that they can have successful lives.
I would keep on emphasizing the housing market too, which is really a difficulty for young adults wishing to set up in the UK.
Okay, I'm going to move on to another question, which is, do you think that subsidized IVF might result in people just leaving things even later? This would then make the other impacts of an aging population even worse. So I think we'll go to you first, Søren, as Denmark has a generous offering. Is this what you're seeing there? And do you think this is a problem?
No, I think it is the other way around, that we are postponing having children, and then we need to have IVF. I mean, we need to be fair and say having IVF is not the fun way to have children. So, I mean, that's not a route that we want to go down. I think that it's I think it's important that we don't focus on finding one thing that can solve this. Just to the previous question, I mean, for instance, in Denmark, we have free access to education. We still have the problem. And we have nice welfare systems, maternity leaves, and so on, and we still have the problem. So, and if you go to Southern Europe, you have 40% youth unemployment. I mean, they have to stay home with their parents, and that's not a nice way to find a partner if you stay home with mom and dad. So, I mean, just to illustrate, I think there is a lot of different reasons for why we have these problems. I think that one of the things that we've been working with fertility awareness and with what we call reproductive sustainability. And when we have educated young people, we have had high school students coming in and educating them on reproduction. It turns out they know very little about reproduction. So they know a lot about contraception, but very little about reproduction. And at least taking with reference to my home environment here, we need to educate young people much, much more about the reproductive limitations that we are born with. We think we are a very fertile species, and I think there's Roger earlier that alluded to that we are not. And we need to educate each other on this, and we need to know each other's biology. I mean, in my country, when we have sex education in 8th or 9th grade, the first thing when you approaches the menstrual cycle is that you tell all the boys to go out and play football while the girls have this talk, meaning that Danish boys have absolutely no idea of how women works in terms of hormones and cycles and all that, and we are very uncomfortable with all these discussions also later in life. So we need to educate each other, and we need to educate also people like myself. I have a 30-year-old daughter and a 35-year-old son, because if we as parents are putting up out of great love to our children a lot of recommendations, wait, and take your education and all these kind of things, we might be adding to their problems. So I think we need to look into all these things, and they might be different in different countries.
And Satu, I'm sure you want to come in about the education side on this.
Yes, definitely, and I totally agree with Søren that education is the key issue here, and that's why we also made the game. And the game results that were revealed last week or 2 weeks ago in the European Parliament show that the biggest problem is that young people don't know that fertility health starts to decline already after 30 and 35, and even for men after 40. So this was one of the big questions, and we also got really good answers from our 4 pilot countries that the young people were really eager to know about these things. So they said, why didn't you put more questions? Why wasn't the game longer? Because they really wanted that information. So I think education of fertility and infertility and reproductive health is the key issue here. Definitely.
And Roger, I think you wanted to come in.
I just wanted to mention that the USA is very backward on this issue. In fact, I suspect that the library police, if I can call them that, have been taking books out of libraries on the subject that we're talking about, on sexual health, on fertility issues, and we're all going backwards.
Yes, it's rather yeah, it goes back to your Handmaid's Tale slide, I'm afraid. Anne, you want to come in?
Well, could I ask a question? Is that permitted of colleagues?
Yes.
Well, one thing, Satu, that sounds a really interesting study. I don't know whether it's in the chat, but perhaps we could have it there. That would be great. This is not my area about sort of fertility education, although my understanding is that there is quite a lot of evidence that young adults don't have very good knowledge. But have any of these educational programs been evaluated and shown to have a sustained effect when these young people are now sort of, in their 20s and 30s?
Well, if I may answer, I think at the moment, basically only UK and France have some kind of program in schools that they teach these issues, and it's only started a few years ago. So I don't think we have the results of that yet.
Thank you.
And Søren, and then I'm going to have to go to the next question because we've got 34.
Yeah, sorry, I'll be very fast. The answer, Ben, is that it doesn't have a lasting effect. I mean, at least not in the way that we have done so far with small films and these type of things. But we are very reluctant to have a real conversation about it, because also those who are teaching are sort of uncomfortable with this. So what we need to do is we need to normalize the talk about having children in an unembarrassed way, because that is what the young people want. They want to have a good discussion, an adult discussion, but they can't talk to their parents, and they won't talk to their children, to their teachers. So we need to find other ways to have adult conversations, because they really want it.
Okay. David, someone's asked from one of your slides, UK had a rapid decline from 1960 to 1980, why has it slowed? Is it immigration or is it something else?
So I think, Anne will correct me if I'm wrong, that the TFR for immigrant families or immigrant women is typically higher by about 0.4, 0.5 than is the case for native-born people. Both have been declining, but it is true that immigrants do tend to or have had higher TFRs than native-born. Of course, it is the question about whether there is an assumption. Well, there is an assumption built into UK population forecast that immigration will continue, perhaps at a slightly lower level than it has been in the last 2 or 3 years. But the implicit assumption that there is an unending supply of immigrants is clearly one that is ultimately cannot be true.
Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to another question. So someone said, Roger, fascinating and thought-provoking presentation. Are you suggesting large-scale IVF is going to weaken global health long term?
I recommended John Aitken's book, and he makes a number of predictions based on natural selection, which I just very briefly summarize. So the questioner may want to turn to his book to look at those in a little bit more detail. It's not something for us to worry about here and now, but it is very plausible that an overuse of assisted reproductive technologies, especially ICSI, is going to reinforce infertility problems. We already know that happens with some Y chromosome deletions. And I don't think this is something that we should worry about really now. but it is an implication. And it's rather fascinating to think how the human species will evolve, and whether it's going to be more through that factor, or why I would think maybe the bigger threat is environmental pollution, and all sorts of other threats that come through global warming and so on, that are going to affect our fertility in the future, quite apart from the social ones that we've been focusing upon. So I would say to the questioner, don't lose sleep over it tonight.
Yes, lots of other things to lose sleep over. Thanks. So there's a question from Emma Sowerby, who says, I specialise in fertility treatment for modern families. I work with single women, same-sex couples, and transgender patients. Has society's increased acceptance of people unable to conceive without ART affected fertility rates significantly? And I think it also ties into an anonymous question that we had about countries where they've got really low total fertility replacement levels, who are, so we say, on the more conservative end of the spectrum, and who will not treat anyone married in a heterosexual relationship. So perhaps we'll go to the demographer first, to Anne, to see if she's got some ideas about the numbers there.
They're likely to be very small. So the answer to the question is, it is, people have individual views. My own personal view is that it's very, very important that we do offer medically assisted techniques to all sorts of family forms. But the number is likely to be low. And in fact, we've done some scoping work recently to try and work out how we might be able to quantify this. And it's really difficult, because we have the numerators from the HFEA register, but we don't have the denominators. So it's very difficult to work out, for example, what proportion of same-sex couples might be seeking treatment, or et cetera, et cetera. So it's a really important question, in my view. And in terms of countries, we can look at Italy, for example, in terms of restrictions to IVF according to family structure. But perhaps just stepping back a little bit, in East Asia, probably one of the reasons why fertility is so low is that because fertility is constrained within marriage. So cohabitation and extramarital fertility within cohabitation is almost exactly half of children born today in the UK are born to cohabiting couples. So if we had to wait till everybody got married, then that would halve fertility.
If no one else wants to come in, okay, I'm going to go with, I suppose it's a comment really, just from Chloe Fosse, who says, I'm in Jersey, so very small demographic, but our recent IVF funding eligibility survey found that of 73 respondents, 38.4% stated that without access to funded IVF, they would not be able to undergo IVF treatment. I think it sort of demonstrates, very nicely, thank you for that, Chloe, the issue that some people have. Someone else, Pablo Cespedes Pino, I hope I pronounced that correctly, says, how can we interpret the micro little baby boom during COVID that happened all over the world? Anne or David, do you want to go on this?
I'll have a little go first, because in my charts from the Nordic countries, there was a micro baby boom, and this was particularly amongst older couples and particularly people having a second child. However, in general, there was a small drop in fertility. So in fact, the Nordic countries were behaving somewhat differently to places like the US and the UK, where in fact there was a decrease in fertility and then some recuperation afterwards.
Anybody else want to come in on that, or shall I? Yes, Søren.
I just support what Jan just said, that in Denmark we had a small increase, but 86% of them were child number 2 or child number 3. So it was more question about family completion than new families coming in.
Did it have very little to do with COVID restrictions, given that Sweden was so different from Denmark in that respect?
Yeah.
Great. Satu wants to come in.
Yeah, just wanted to say that we had the same here in Finland as in Denmark, that there was a little rise. But if I'm very rude, or if I'm allowed to say this, I mean, we have long and dark winters and people were working home, so they probably didn't find anything else to do. No, that's not true. But we heard these comments that it was easier to take care of the little child because everybody was working from home and there was help to take care of the babies. So yeah.
Okay, and then I think the final question is going to be from Katie Rollins, who asks, which countries do you believe have got the closest solution to fertility decline issues? And what are their male factor fertility stats? The person who can answer the first bit may not know the answer to the second. So who do you think has got closest? I think this perhaps, who wants to go on first on this one? I think we've worn them out. Let's go with we'll go with Anne first, and then we'll perhaps go to Roger to see what he thinks, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, I think my answer is going to be not satisfactory to the answer, because I think it's actually the wrong question. This is people have differing views. A lot of demographers would agree with me that actually the right question to be asking is what government have got policies right to adjust to a low fertility setting. Now, I'm talking at a population level, not in terms of an individual level where we should be providing opportunities and reproductive rights for those who wish to have children. That's slightly different to saying, what government has successfully increased fertility. It's two slightly different questions. For example, going back to Finland, my colleagues, Mikko Merskilä has been showing through his academic simulation that by increasing education and reducing the number of NEETs in Finland, you can actually expand the labour force to exactly the same amount as to encouraging fertility to certain levels. And I think it's this sort of work that we need to show, that perhaps from that perspective, that's what's really required.